Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, May 15th, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about New Mexico and Minnesota, two swing states for the 2022 midterm elections, where we have governor elections with two vulnerable, potentially speaking at least, Democratic incumbents that are vying for re-election. Tim Walz from the state of Minnesota, who served as a representative in a now Republican district, not necessarily because of redistricting, but more so because he was one of the few Democrats who could actually win in such a region, won in 2018 by a pretty substantial amount, now running for re-election in a much different environment than previously. Same thing goes for the New Mexico governor. An incumbent Democrat who was first elected back in 2018 actually flipped the seat from a red governor, Republican governor back in 2018. That is Michelle Lujan Grisham, and she is also running for re-election. So looking at these new sets of polls, one color should really jump out to you right now, and that is the color blue. You are finding that the Republican Party isn't winning in these potential head-to-head matchups between a Democratic incumbent versus another type of Republican. If you take a look at some of these numbers, they are exceptionally large numbers for incumbent governors at this point in time, especially as Democrats in swing states. And we'll talk about that swing state status as we get a bit further down the line. But you find numbers such as Tim Walz up by 5, which doesn't seem substantial, but is pretty noticeable, especially when you're talking about a race, again, that Hillary Clinton only won in this state by 1.5 back in 2016. When the environment isn't necessarily good for Democrats, they aren't supposed to be doing well in these states, certainly not up by 5 at a bare minimum. It goes all the way up to 7, 10, 10, 10, 12-point leads for Governor Tim Walz. Quite impressive to say the least. But there is also a catch, the fact that he is only at 44%, 43%, 45%, 46%, 47% in some of these polls. However, I will say that you did start to see some very similar polls form at the early stages of the 2018 general election season. Right around this time, 4 years ago, you saw that governor candidates that Democrats ended up winning by pretty substantial margins, such as Minnesota, started out with a very similar pathway. As for New Mexico, Democrats really have exceptional leads in almost every single one of these races except for one. But the interesting thing about this is that Lujan Grisham is actually outperforming her approval rating in every single one of these polls. It is quite interesting. But what you find is that while she's up by only 4 against one governor candidate, she's up by 10 against the other, 12 against the other, 16 against another. These are large leads, and it does show that there is probably going to be a narrowing up of the race, but that Democrats have a lot of room to fall. And one thing that I do think I was expecting at least partially was that these races were certainly going to be closer than this. I thought that potentially we could see a narrowing up of these races simply because of the national environment and where we currently stand. If you take a look at my election projection for the governor's races, I kept them as likely Democrat. I think I might have moved them over back to lean for a very brief period of time, but I've pretty much been sticking with that likely blue characterization more recently. I did have it as tilt red, but keep in mind the dates and time that this prediction came around. This is immediately following Glenn Youngkin's victory, and this is in a time period where there was a huge expectation for Republicans to build momentum and start to build and surf on this red wave that was supposed to land them in many governor's offices and Washington, D.C. And while it still very much might, I don't think we are seeing the level of a red wave that could have been maintained had the Glenn Youngkin energy, the Glenn Youngkin enthusiasm that we saw in Virginia for the Republican Party been kept on a national level. I will say there have been a number of things, especially the recent leak from the United States Supreme Court, that has really halted a lot of discussion around inflation, around COVID-19, around healthcare policy, around a lot of things that the Democratic Party simply isn't doing well in, that the Republican Party could have capitalized on and will still very much capitalize on. But there is now a revamped issue of abortion access and abortion rights. And in any race where that matters the most, it's not a congressional race. It's a governor's race. It's a race where you could find a governor who could sign a law into law, sign a bill into law in your individual state. If Minnesota was to elect a Republican, what's stopping the Republican-controlled state legislature from passing an abortion ban? The Supreme Court seems as if they would be likely to uphold it. They want to completely overturn Roe v. Wade, thus removing all protections in place against laws of that nature. You have a governor candidate, the former Republican governor in Maine, who is running, who has said publicly now that he will pursue a pro-life initiative if he is elected, stating that he's been pro-life from day one. You have Glenn Youngkin, who was caught on a hot mic, stating that if the Republicans win control of the state Senate in 23, maintain control of the House of Delegates, that they will go on the offensive against abortion access in the state of Virginia. It might have been a blue state in the 2020 election, but that doesn't mean much unless the governor actually sides with those voters. And if it's a Republican, the answer is probably not. So I think that's something that also could be taken into account when we look at these numbers. This could be a recent bump up for these Democratic candidates that otherwise might not have been there. Had the consistent trend of the nation been applied to these individual states, Minnesota and New Mexico, there is a very real possibility that these extremely large leads would eventually be dialed down. It's just something to think about. But at the end of the day, what these numbers are telling us is that these governor candidates do have a lot of room for movement, both up and down. There is still a real possibility that Tim Walz and Michelle Lujan Grisham end up losing in 2022. But there's also a pretty good chance that they don't. I think a lot of this also has to come down with approval. I mentioned approval previously. The interesting thing about all of the governors up for re-election in 2022 is that every single one of them is popular. Every single one except for one in the state of Wisconsin. And that's quite interesting to say the least. I think that at this point in time, you never really expect that many governors to be approved of. But that's just the reality of where we are right now. And honestly, it's good for many of these states to actually appreciate their governors because it means at least something is going right in our world of politics where it seems like a lot is going wrong all the time. But in Minnesota specifically, Tim Walz enjoys a plus 11 net approval across the state. It's a very good approval rating, and it's something that he has been maintaining since he has been elected. I remind you that Tim Walz is a candidate who did well in congressional races where he otherwise shouldn't have, and did well in 2018. Michelle Lujan Grisham, on the other hand, is only up by about 3 points across the state of New Mexico. Now, to give you a point of reference about the competitive nature or how competitive these states can actually get, this isn't a perfect example for New Mexico. The governor's race from 2014 and 2010 probably is, but for Minnesota, it definitely is. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won the state of Minnesota by less than 50,000 votes out of nearly 3 million cast. And Hillary Clinton won by 1.5% across a state that hadn't even voted for Ronald Reagan back in 1984. You are talking about the state with the longest lasting Democratic streak right now, going for the Democrats in every election since 1972, not including 1972. In 1984, every single state went red except for Minnesota. And for it to get close in 2016, in fact, this close, shows that Donald Trump did something right, Hillary Clinton did something wrong, and that Minnesota, while having this very long streak, is not against potentially electing Republicans. Shows you the competitive nature of the state. But I also want to direct your attention to 2018 before I show you the competitiveness of New Mexico. Because 2018 was an exceptional year for these Democratic candidates. Tim Walz won by 11 points statewide. It wasn't even close. This is 10 points better than Hillary Clinton's margin of victory just 2 years later. What was different? The national environment and the candidate. Tim Walz was well received, well liked across the state, and he still is. That's a good thing, and there's a reason why he's up by this amount despite the Democrats being down on the generic ballot, Biden being down 12 points nationwide. You're finding so many numbers that are telling us the Democrats should be down in a state that Clinton barely won, that Biden won by 7. If Virginia went to Biden by 10 and flipped red, why isn't Minnesota red? In fact, not only is why not Minnesota red, why also is Tim Walz up by 10, 12 points against some challengers? That is the real question. Why is Tim Walz up by 5 points at a bare minimum? These are questions that should be asked, and it all circles back to approval and room to fall from the last election. Minnesota went blue in an open race by 11 points, but again, it was 2018. New Mexico, on the other hand, I find a very difficult time trying to even piece together, where we see the Democrats really faltering in this race, primarily because such of a tremendous victory back in 2018. Michelle Lujan Grisham, again, not the incumbent, actually with a Republican governor, Susan Martinez at this point in time, the Democrat, Lujan Grisham, won with 57% of the vote to the Republicans, 42.8. This was a 15-point victory. 15-point victory across the state of New Mexico, outperforming Clinton in 16, outperforming Biden in 20. You are looking at a landslide victory in a state that otherwise was deemed competitive by many, many Republicans back in 2018 because they had an incumbent. Incumbency matters, but it only matters in some circumstances. But clearly, it is an effective tool at garnering support for yourself across a state. Because if you're popular, you're probably going to win re-election. If we're being realistic about this, it isn't just these two states where we should see this. It's just these two states where you have numbers. But for instance, if we were to look at New York, Kathy Hochul is going to win. Sure, it's a blue state, but approval rating does matter. Because in the neighboring blue state of Vermont, Phil Scott is extremely popular. He's a Republican, and he's going to win. Same thing in New Hampshire. Connecticut, surprisingly enough, they actually like their governor. First time in forever. Ned Lamont looks like he's on track to win re-election. That state actually has gotten pretty competitive. If you take a look at other states, California, probably going to re-elect their governor. Colorado, no doubt in my mind, they re-elect their governor. There's a reason Steve Sisolak seems to be performing at least okay. But also, I'm a bit apprehensive about his chances at victory, but that is also something that we can discuss later down the line. For right now, I keep it as lean D. There were times where I was skeptical about a victory, but more so confident now looking at a lot of these numbers. But the point is that popularity does bring you a long way, and that Democrats aren't immune to that just because they're down in a generic ballot nationwide. The numbers might have them down by about 4 points according to Real Clear Politics, 2 points according to FiveThirtyEight, but that doesn't always translate to victories for the GOP in many of these races. And there also is a lot to unpack when it comes down to Roe v. Wade and the possibility of it being overturned. Because people look to their governor first. They don't look to Biden. They don't look to the Senate. They don't look to the House because in many cases, this is now going to return to a state-by-state issue. And if a governor is elected that is a Republican, even if there is a Republican voter out there, if they are pro-choice, there will be some apprehensiveness about backing a candidate who might vie to ban abortion across the state. I know there's this argument that abortion access and abortion rights isn't the most important issue to voters, especially in a time where people are struggling to get food on the table, struggling to pay their bills, struggling to get gas because of the high rise in costs, because of our crisis in Europe, because of everything that is happening across the nation, because of worldwide inflation. These things that people attribute with the Democratic Party, with Biden, and might not necessarily sway their vote on the issue of abortion. I think the majority of voters who were already set out, 80, 90, maybe 92, 93%, that were voting for the Republican Party from the beginning are still very much going to do that. And they're going to do that because they don't like the Democrats. And abortion rights and abortion access isn't something that they will view, potentially even on the Democratic Party side, even if they might be pro-choice too. I don't necessarily think they're going to swing their votes simply because of that issue. But there is a good chunk, at least, 5-10%, that will keep this into consideration in heavy ways. It may not seem like a lot, but 5-10% of a core electorate for the GOP is very important. Because people may be willing to back a Democrat on the governor level simply because they don't think that this governor will be going against abortion access in a state that otherwise might have been providing it or has been providing it, like every other state, technically speaking, for 49 years now. That is something to consider as well. Of course, if the Supreme Court decision is changed from the leaked draft, then potentially something could be changing. But at the end of the day, what we expect and what we know is that the court is a 6-3 Republican composition, conservative, whatever we want to call it, if we want to be honest about it or not. You also have, a decision that's been leaked, confirmed by Justice Roberts, written by Justice Alito, people who, testified saying that they would not vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, or at least insinuated it, that now are. So you have a lot of people coming out and a majority opinion that seems to defy what was said in hearings, meaning that this is probably something that is set in stone. They wouldn't do something this, public if they weren't expecting some type of pushback. It seems very clear that they were not expecting at least this to get out, and that it was going to be a decision that comes out in June, that they were going to just make the decision free of their own accord. But of course, there is a lot to unpack in that circumstance. But there is a section of voters that will consider abortion access to be a top issue, where otherwise it might not even have been in their top 10, because it wasn't an issue in terms of what was going to happen with the Supreme Court until now. Until Amy Coney Barrett stepped foot in that court and the composition changed from 5-4 to 6-3. Because it seems very apparent that this majority opinion is a 5-4 ruling. meaning that had there been another liberal justice, it would have failed just as every other proposition has to overturn the precedent of Roe v. Wade across this nation. So I think that can partially explain the lead that we see for these Democratic candidates. I also think popularity is a very major factor. But I think we have a very unavoidable issue now, which is abortion access and abortion rights, that makes it very difficult to even take that out of consideration, because I can guarantee you that will be in consideration and actively is in consideration at this point in time. We will watch these races as we proceed. The Minnesota governor race, the New Mexico governor races could very well become competitive, but they also could be strongholds and maintaining leads for the Democratic Party. We will see what happens. Right now, the Democrats seem to be up well, but the election is in 6 months' time, which means a lot can change, but the question is, will it? Because these numbers look very similar to how they were just a year ago, when you saw numbers coming out of these states that were expected to be competitive that looks like way further down the line might not be as competitive as otherwise thought by the Republican Party. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 governor election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.